Good evening, Wakefield, and welcome to the Tri-Board meeting for Thursday, October 17th, 2019. This is a rather historic night tonight in that we're bringing together the Wakefield Town Council, the Wakefield School Committee, and the Wakefield Finance Committee to go through and discuss a number of issues relative to budgeting and the fiscal health of the town generally. I'd like to begin this evening by introducing two of my counterparts. To my left is Dan Sherman. He's the chairman of the Finance Committee, and to my right is Chris Callanan. He is the chair of the School Committee. First off, I'd ask everyone to please rise and ask the two other chairs to join me in leading the Pledge of Allegiance. Oh, we're not. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everyone. Item number 3 on our agenda is public comment. Madam Clerk, do we have anyone that's signed in for public comment this evening?
Yes, we do. Will?
If you could please step up to the microphone, identify yourself by name and provide your address. And public comment this evening is intended to be limited to 3 minutes. In the event that
Thank you. Yeah, good evening. My name is Will Carvin-Yaris, and I am the proud president of the Wakefield Teachers Association. Is this on? It's not. Can you hear me? Great. Should I come closer? It's on now? There we go. All right, perfect. My name is Will Carvin-Yaris, and I'm the proud president of the Wakefield Education Association. I have been incredibly lucky to work for the past 9 years in Wakefield. I'm an English teacher, and I'm a special education teacher at the high school, and I am the advisor to the award-winning theater program here in Wakefield. Tonight, I am joined... Can you not hear me? Oh. Tonight, I am joined by fellow educators, paraprofessional staff, and secretaries to address ongoing funding concerns and discussions about our schools. We are here tonight to let this body know that we care fervently about our students, their educational opportunities, and we are steadfastly committed to Wakefield's future. Over the past few years, the WEA has made a concerted effort to be a collaborative and reasonable partner with the school administration and town in problem solving our common challenges. Our hope is that throughout this school year, the town will utilize our membership as a resource when considering not only budgetary challenges, but pedagogical, curricular, and cultural challenges as well. The teachers are currently working without a contract. Last spring, we reached an impasse, but as of last night, I am happy to say that we are finally making progress. Our contractual updates are not obtuse. They are student-centered, respectful, and educationally in the best interest of both students and teachers. I look forward to making more progress with Mr. Markham, Ms. Guida, and Ms. Fortier. The research is undeniably clear. Decisions made with educator and student voices are essential for school district success. Over the past couple of years, our needs in our schools have increased exponentially. We have a rising English language learner population. We are in the midst of a social-emotional epidemic, and we are bringing more special education students back home where they belong. The demands on classroom teachers are now laughable. But instead of getting what we need, we, as teachers, are forced to listen to town meetings and read newspaper headlines that talk about a mythological 4% ceiling to our annual district budget increase. Things that we need to succeed in our schools are being cut. But we have heard you, and like all good teachers, we've worked harder. We've worked harder in our classrooms, and we've worked with fellow teachers in other districts. We've worked with union leaders, and we've worked with elected officials. We have written emails, and we have marched, and we've made phone calls. We got Wakefield some extra money. Almost $360,000 this year in additional Chapter 70 aid. And there could be a lot more coming. With the likely passage of the Student Opportunity Act, which, by the way, was written by Wakefield State Senator Jason Lewis and passed unanimously in the State Senate, Wakefield will likely see over $1 million more in Chapter 70 aid from the state each year by the year 2026. This is a huge change to the status quo of school funding, and it is change that the WA and MTA members all over the state fought for and won this past spring. Now we need your help. The act now sits in the State House of Representatives. Tomorrow, I need you to contact Representative Wong and ask for his support. We also need you to make sure that there are no major changes to this bill. There were some failed amendments left on the Senate floor, specifically around the idea of accountability. The issue is that those failed amendments weren't really about accountability. They were punitive and damaging. Those amendments were specifically added to make sure that funding could be withheld if a district wasn't meeting certain thresholds. That's right. The writers of those amendments wanted to withhold funding from the districts that needed the money the most. Given our ever-changing population here in Wakefield, that could be us one day. To add an accountability measure would mean that your superintendent isn't doing his job, that your school committee isn't doing their job, and that your teachers aren't doing their job. That is certainly not the message you want to send. Ultimately, we believe in the idea that better working conditions for educators and staff translate into better learning conditions for our students. Our aim is always to provide the best educational experience possible for our students, but our teachers are maximized. Much has been said recently about the funding of our schools, and though we may have very different perspectives about the nature of our funding needs, I want to outline for you some ways our members and community partners have suggested Wakefield could invest in these schools. 1, class sizes. Almost without exception, Wakefield educators report and studies confirm that smaller classes produce better learning. Smaller classes make it possible to give individual attention. For students in grades K through 8, class sizes of 13 to 18 are recommended, with variations depending on student age, population, and subject area. Ask any of our educators, or better yet, our students, your children, and they will tell you we are currently off the mark in terms of class size. Our kindergarten classes are already in the 20s, with new housing options, a beautiful middle school, and more construction down the street. Young families are moving to Wakefield. More children will come to our schools. The funding bill will help offset this growth. Our students are also facing big problems with addictions, food and housing insecurity, and more frequently, social-emotional crises. With full funding, we could have the resources to address these complex issues before they transform into tragedies. Here in Wakefield, we're dancing the fine line of whether or not we can meet the needs of all students in our schools. And finally, special education. Wakefield Public Schools have an obligation to meet the needs of every student. Students with special learning needs require respected, certified educators, appropriate levels of intervention, and active participation in the broader school community. Our students deserve special education support staff who have expertise in autism, physical disabilities, emotional and behavioral difficulties, and cognitive challenges in each school. Our challenges change every year, and sometimes every day. With full funding, we can meet any challenge that comes our way. We have hundreds of amazing educators who are passionately working above and beyond to serve the kids on this town. They're right in front of you. They are highly qualified, dedicated, and excellent agents of change. Sure. Again, teachers in Wakefield are maximized. Our schools are founded primarily on pillars of social connection and personal relationships. How goes the schools? So goes the town. An investment in the schools is an investment for Wakefield's future. Fully funded schools with reasonable class sizes and the necessary staff and resources lead to better schools. We are here tonight fighting for our kids and fighting for the future they deserve. Come visit us in our schools and come see what teaching looks like in 2019. It has changed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. Madam Clerk, do we have any other public participation this evening? We do not. Okay. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Item number 4 on the agenda is chair comments. I will offer some brief remarks, as will my counterparts on the other 2 committees as well. First off, again, I want to thank everyone who's come out tonight or is taking part in what is a rather historic event for us as a community. It's an opportunity for us to bring together the 3 leading boards within our town to talk about bigger issues for the town generally, to talk about the budget. This is actually the first step in our budget process for this upcoming fiscal year. This is something that we've not done previously, come together, talked about budget planning, and looked at ways that we can improve processes in a time that has not been in crisis, but in fact in a time where we find ourselves in a rather stable position. Wakefield is uniquely positioned in that our surrounding communities are talking about and passing overrides in order to meet their operating expenses. We are fortunate not to be doing that. We are a community that's able to look at capital projects and look at how we can have sound fiscal policies going forward to ensure that we have a sustainability in terms of our financial investments and our financial commitments to our community and to those employed by the town. This has all been going on, while a lot of other communities have just not had that same level of financial success, and we're very fortunate for that, and we have a lot of people to thank for that, not the least of whom are gathered here tonight. The Finance Committee does a phenomenal job in supporting the efforts of making sure that we are strong as a community, budget-wise, and making sure that we're fiscally prudent with the dollars we're spending, your taxpayer dollars. We have a school committee that's committed to excellence in education for all children within Wakefield, and I know that they work tirelessly to that end. And we have a town council that's committed to making sure that the operations and the policies and the priorities of this town are advanced on behalf of all townspeople. And for that, I'm truly thankful. I thank everyone here that is volunteering their time and their talent to be able to deliver the types of results we have currently as a community. We have much to be proud of. Couple that with a AAA bond rating as another indicator of the sort of financial responsibility that everyone takes very seriously here within our community. And a lot of this is because of the great work of each of the bodies, but it's not often that we have as much overlap between the bodies. And so tonight is intended for an opportunity to have that overlap, to create the synergy that's so important to make sure that we continue to advance on the right path forward financially. And that's what we're looking to do here tonight. There are many priorities, and priorities take many different forms. And we want to be sure that we are realizing these priorities. So as I mentioned, this is the first step in what I consider to be a revised budgeting process. When I sought to convene this meeting a few months ago, it was with the expectation that we'd be able to come together, share ideas, have a clear understanding, and all leave here on the same page to know what the future holds and what we each have to do as members of our respective bodies to be sure that we're advancing things forward. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Dan Sherman, the chair of the Finance Committee, for some opening remarks.
Thank you. So I'm just going to repeat a number of things that Ed had just said. It is a new start. It is something that the Finance Committee has talked about at length last spring about how we're doing our work and the way it's working. We thought it could be better. And so we're pushing forward on this, and I think this is a great first step. I was part of the first tri-board meeting in 2008 when the whole circumstances were much different than they are today. We were facing 25 to 30% cuts from state aid. We were cutting school crossing guards. We were cutting library hours. We were cutting everywhere. And it was a very, very tough meeting, a very difficult meeting. I think this is going to be much more upbeat than that, and it wouldn't take much to be more upbeat. So I'm very glad to have it, and I'm glad we're doing this. I think it's a bit overdue. The other thought I had was similar to what Ed's comments was. I really think in this as being a foundation that we're building tonight. That said, okay, here's where we're at. Here's where we think things are going, and let's go forward and figure out some of the nits, the details, and throughout the budget process, pin down some things that we think we need to address Wakefield has problems. We have issues we have to address. We'll be talking a lot about those tonight. I'm looking forward to tonight's session.
Thank you. And next, Chris Callahan, the chair of the school committee.
I too was on that 2008 meeting. It was a much different time. I'm just pleased to be able to be here and recognize the school committee that works so well collaboratively together. We're not a board that fights. We're a board that discusses. And I think there's a big difference there. And we can have open discussions and not always agree, which I'm sure there'll be some disagreement here tonight about the best approach, but we all have the same goal in mind. And if we just got to work collaboratively to achieve that. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, item number 5 on tonight's agenda is the financial condition of the town. Certainly it's important to know where we are before we can talk about where we're going. And so with that, I'll turn it over to, again, Dan Sherman, the chair of the Finance Committee, who has several slides to follow along with this evening.
Yeah, thank you. Probably one of the more important items in our revenue side is what our local receipts are. And this is highly variable. As you can see from the slide, it goes up, it goes down, it moves quite a bit. And it really provides a lot of the impetus for being able to do some new things. The state aid has not been moving very well. Our tax levy, we know what that's going to be. We have a pretty good idea how that's going to move. But our local receipts is a highly variable amount. And one of the things I'm pointing out in the slide is that in fiscal year 19, we just got the numbers, the final number. Thank you very much, Kevin. And it's up about 9% from where it was the year before, 2018. So it's rock solid. And the leading elements that pushed that up was the motor vehicle excise tax was solid at 3.9%, which is the blue bar at the bottom. That's the biggest element, and that went up 3.8%. Penalties and interest on taxes went up 20%, very good. And then licenses and permit went up 35%. So we have a lot of licenses and permit fees that went up 35%. So those things led the charge in terms of a 9% increase in local receipts. So that becomes our base for discussion in terms of our expected receipts for 20 and 21. Next slide, please, Steve. So I mentioned state aid, and we're still, even at this late date in 2019, less than where we were in 2002. So when state aid was cut, you can see how it went down in 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way down to 2011. It was all the way down to $7.83 million from a high of 10.9, almost $11 million. So that's in 2008, of course, that they had another big cut. You can see that. So that's when we really had our first tri-board meeting, because obviously that hurt. Millions of dollars are going out the door that we weren't going to see. But now we're in 2019, we're up to 10.3. We expect that to go to about 10.8 and over 11 for 2021. So it's going in the right direction. In terms of what we have for reserves, again, this is money that we have as a rainy day fund. We can tap the stabilization fund with a 2/3 vote at town meeting. So if we have something that comes up that's important, critical, maybe an emergency, anything like that, we need the stabilization fund. And it got pretty much decimated in 2005. Again, going back to the dot-com crisis, that torpedoed it a bit. And it's slowly been increasing to the point now as a balance. It's roughly $3 million. As a percentage of total pay, it's about total budget, it's about 3%, which is somewhat on target where we want it to be. A little higher, perhaps. Next year, we might add a little bit to that. The following slide, free cash. This is our checking account. This is money that we have and we can spend. It's at roughly $8.6 million at the end of fiscal year 19. A little less than it has been, but at 8% of the total budget, it's where we want it to be. So if you think about the reserves, our 8% here plus our 3% for stabilization, we're over 10%. And the policies that we've adopted, we being the Finance Committee and at the time Selectmen, now Town Council, is we want these reserves to be at least 10% of the total annual spend. So we're at that point. So we're in good shape there versus where we were in 2009, 2010. We had very little free cash. Not a good spot to be. Following slide on debt service fund. This debt service fund is a fund that we use to pay off and purchase rehab, our Franklin School, for example. The money from that sale went into this debt fund, and then we use those monies to do the field renovations, the public safety building, the library renovation, all those various capital projects, the big projects, is funded through the debt service fund. For the last several years, it's been more of a pay-as-you-go. As you can see, the balance really hasn't moved very much. But we're going to get into a discussion later on as to where we think this debt service fund is going to go into the future. As some of those projects come offline, the Dolbear, the Woodville, and so forth, they come off, and the debt service fund is going to start moving upwards unless we start spending on something else. So the next slide is our capital budget and what we've been spending. It's a little bit complicated because I've combined it in a couple different ways. The pink line and the green line, which are at the bottom of the graph, show the total capital, and as a percentage of budget, we're spending about $2 million. We expect to spend about $2 million again in this fiscal year, and the following fiscal year represents about 2% of our budget. But if I add into it the bonds that we've issued for the Dolbear, Woodville, Library, Public Safety, and all those other projects, now you say, well, our total capital spend is actually more than that. So you can see the upper line, for example, is roughly just over $5 million is what we spend on capital when you combine it with the bonds, and representing about 5% of our total annual budget. So we've got that in pretty good shape. And the process, I'm going to turn that
Great.
over to Steve.
So actually, just before that, I know that we have a lot of participants this evening. After each of the agenda items, I'd like to take a moment, and if anyone has a comment or a question relative to what has just been presented, this would be the time to do that. If you could just raise your hand, and I'll acknowledge you, and then we would go from there. All right.
Everybody's good.
Seeing none then, item number 6 then is the budget process. As I indicated, this is the first step in what I'll call a revised or an enhanced or an improved budget process. Our town administrator, Mayo, and I met with the Finance Committee over the summer to talk about the ways in which the Finance Committee identified concerns that they had relative to the previously existing process, and ways in which we could enhance the process. So I think we have a lot of really good opportunities here going forward, and this is the first step that we're looking to implement relative to that new budget process. So with that, Mr. Mayo, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Anyways, I was at a seminar the other day, and it was given by the Department of Revenue, and Chris Harding, who was the Commissioner of Revenue in Massachusetts, was talking about he's going to be presenting the governor's budget, or the governor will be presenting his budget right around the end of January, when we'll get that normally during the Mass Municipal Association annual meeting. And he started that by saying how little he knows right now about the budget. And I feel that way every year, because there's really very little I know for sure in setting the budget at this time. I make some assumptions and, do a lot of reading and talking to people. But one thing I do know for sure, and we'll get to that in a little while, is I do know what probably the tax levy will be next year. Other than that, it's an assumption game. So it's always an interesting analysis that we have. Town accountant, town treasurer, and I go back and forth, certainly with members of town council and with the finance committee to go forward. But anyway, so we're starting that analysis probably even earlier than the fall. We meet with the boards and committees to talk about this. And then we go to our town hall departments, and I'll talk mainly about the municipal side of government here. And we actually encourage them to level fund all but contractual items in their budgets as a way that we start. And any new projects or hires or what have you will be linked to budget priorities. You may say we want to hire a fire prevention officer, budget priority, things like that we go to, and that would be flowing from the town council and from others. And I will show you that every line item is reviewed, and it's even stationary, although we don't really have stationery anymore, it's paper. paper clips and things like that. Every line item is reviewed in every budget for every department, so it is a long process. We then start presentations to the town council and finance committee. There are liaisons from the town council and the finance committee to departments or groups of departments. And then we prepare for that presentation in the spring at what we affectionately call the Dog and Pony Show, where we go through the budgets with everybody, and then we go to town meeting and have those budgets voted on. So I think any budget, and I think you can say that whether it's the school budget or it's the town side of the budget, it does reflect values. And these are the items that are on the municipal side of government. I would certainly say that the education of all of our citizens in Wakefield, or our guests in Wakefield, is very important, particularly the school students. So although that's not here in the municipal side, it is on our thoughts as well. And we really look to provide the best service we can for the most affordable price. And some of the items that we really look at is we look at public safety. Are we doing enough in the area of public safety? Whether that be police, fire, health, what have you. Roads, sidewalks, and streetscapes, that is a big issue over the last few years, and the community has spoken loud and clear and has added more money to those budgets right on this floor at town meeting. And that is very appropriate. Drainage is taking on a much more importance in the town when we look at our vulnerable populations and vulnerable areas with something called climate change that seems to me that it's scientific. From what I've looked at, there seems to be plenty of evidence that it's true, and that is something that we are looking at. We're looking at water storage areas, and that's going to be a huge item we're going to be talking about in the next years. Drainage has already been a problem for years, but it's taking on a kind of a new life. Capital improvements. We have learned over the years that we need to take care of our buildings and of our other amenities and of our technology and what have you. So right now we have some pretty big things on the agenda. Public safety building for one, DPW garage, fields, although we've made a great progress there, and certainly the high school is something that we'll be talking about. Another budget priority is recreation activities for all ages. We're finding out that more and more people, they thrive activities in this town. They thrive educational and fun activities. And we're seeing more and more people take advantage of our opportunities at the senior center, our young people at the Boys and Girls Club at our civic center, people wanting to use the lake, what have you. There's a lot of things that are happening there that we need to think about and move forward on. We've also talked a lot about making Wakefield affordable. I think, when you look at our taxes around, our surrounding communities, we are certainly not the highest. We're a lot less than some of the other communities. When you look at our water and sewer fees and other the whole totality of living in Wakefield, those are tough for new families coming into town, and we understand that, and that's something we certainly look at. Lake Quannapowitt. We actually have a new committee that's just formed to look at that, look at the lake and what we can do to make that better and more appealing and actually bring more people into town. Something the town council has talked about a lot over the last few years, and we were actually in the process of moving forward on this, is economic development and looking about hiring an economic development director position. So that person would go out, hopefully market Wakefield to the world, to bring in new businesses that would add taxes, add fees to the town, and would actually help us fund some of those other items that we're looking at. A huge issue right now is sustainability. We're going to be talking about this later on. There are a lot of things happening with climate change. We talked about it, with the cost of removal of trash in town, with we're going to have to look at air conditioning all our schools and what have you, because of the warmth and what's going on. So that's a huge issue going forward in our other buildings. Social well-being of the community, and I think we have made great strides here, and there's a lot more for us to do. Over the last few years, this has been a real priority. We've hired a recovery coach to help some of our disadvantaged people in town to not only, it's not enough just to apply Narcan to them, but let's make sure they don't come back, so we need to see them again. That's a part-time position. We have arrangements with some of the social agencies in town where we actually have a social clinician go around with our police and help things and help these people. We need to do more of that. There's a population that needs that. Substance abuse prevention. We have a youth action team that's fabulous. I know the school committee has had the chance to see them, as has the town council. We need to do more of that as well. So anyways, we take that whole backdrop of what we want to do. Dan talked a little about our financial policies. We want to always have free cash for that if items happen, stabilization for that rainy day, and reserve fund, but we didn't talk about that. In case certain budgets go over during the year because of an unforeseen circumstance, we want to make sure we have a little bit of money aside so the finance committee can look at that at the end of the year. So that's something we look at as well. So how do we get to fiscal year 21 next year? So we're talking about that. What do I know? I know that real estate taxes will probably be around $76.2 million. I know that because I take last year's taxes and I multiplied that 1.025, 2.5%, and I know that number. Local receipts, I'm a little bit more conservative than Dan is on local receipts. Kevin Gill, our town accountant, is more conservative than I am in local receipts. So I'm counting on $7.25 million in local receipts as we go forward. The municipal gas and light department pays us a little over $900,000 as a payment in lieu of taxes. State aid, hopefully with some increases in Chapter 70, and I hope that the optimism rings true, and with some other areas of state aid, I'm hoping that state aid would come in around $11.5 million. That is a little bit of a stretch over last year, but I'm cautiously optimistic. New growth. New growth is new construction in town. So when you see these new buildings going up or new companies going up or what have you, we add that to our tax base. New growth is been around $1 million or so over the last few years. And although we expect next year to be about 2.5 million, reason being is that some of the new growth that is being brought in by the power line, particularly the enhancements to the substation on Montrose Ave, is going to add to that number. So we're hoping to see a little bit more there. School Business Authority. This actually has gone down from last year, and I guess that's a good thing because the Dahlberg School will be all paid. The last payment to the Dahlberg School is in this fiscal year, so we're not going to get the state money on the Dahlberg School anymore, and so this will be one of the last payments on the Woodville. Years ago, the way the School Business Authority worked is that you actually went out and borrowed the entire amount of the project, and then the state paid you in about 50% in the case of Wakefield of the bond payment every year. The way it works now is that we only borrow our half of the project and pay that on our own. So that's a little bit different. So we won't be seeing School Business Authority payments anymore, which is a good thing because that entire kind of mortgage payment on the Montrose School is going to go off. The way I make up for the local receipts with the 8.5 that will probably come in is we will use some free cash. So we're looking at a budget of around $100 million for next year. So that's kind of a really bare bones on the income side and the revenue side. And like I said, I'll know more in January, but I think we talk a lot about this in the office, and I'm pretty comfortable where we are for next year. Well, let me go to think about what our budgets are going to be, what the actual costs are going to be. And so we look at all of the operating budgets, and operating budgets includes all the municipal departments, from my office to the school department, to police, to fire, to building department, and that's around 67 to 68 million for next year. That's representing about a 4% increase over last year. So that's what I look at, and we're going forward again, what is sustainable. We then look at our fixed costs, and our fixed costs are items like health insurance, other insurances in the town. We've been very, very fortunate on the health insurance end. Town got into the GIC a number of years ago, and the State Insurance Commission has kept those increases fairly low. And our staff has done a great job there. So that's 12 million of that 21 million. And we have a pension obligations in there as well. Also in that is $850,000 for our snow and ice removal. Last year, we looked at the final numbers last year, and I think we spent on snow and ice removal $849,000 $800. So we hit it by about $200, which was good. So we've been increasing that amount over the year to hit that. Articles, those are items that we vote on at town meeting. Okay, it could be the article for Blatts Field. It could be the article for another project in town. But the largest there, our largest two articles there is refuse and recycling and roads. We put money into roads and sidewalks. So those are big numbers there. Debt service, Dan put that slide up there. This is how we pay our ongoing obligations. We actually put money out of our revenue every year into that, and that pays those bonds out on those items, like the Woodville School, like the public safety building, like the field enhancements at the high school. Then we have some assessments that come against us. One is overlay account. Now, overlay is that whenever we go and we tax everybody, people file for abatements, and we may not receive the taxes that we anticipated. So we put some money aside in what's on an overlay account to pay for those taxes that maybe are lowered for whatever reason or another. That money accumulates, and we can use that after there are no assessments or abatements that could come back against us. State and county assessments. This is a big kahuna from the state. Now, the state will say they're going to give us $11.5 million. Great, as in that other slide. They're also going to take $2 million away. And the big two amounts there are charter school sending tuition, which is about $1.2 million, and MBTA, which is about $600,000. So those are the big amounts that are coming there. And the state does give us about $41,000 for the library. I wish that was more. So I show it as a debit on one side and a credit on the other. So right now, as I look at what's happening for next year, I look at we are about pretty, I see us as being pretty even, pretty balanced. Of course, a lot of things can happen. We could get a big spike in insurance, although that's unlikely. We could see other big things coming in that could make changes. But at this point, I think that we're feeling fairly confident where we are on October 17th for a budget that we'll vote on in May. But we have a long way to go. This is just the beginning of the process. So all three of our chairs tonight talked about the process that we have. And it's been a great process, a great collaboration between all of the committees up here. And I'll tell you, that does not happen everywhere. I talked to a lot of town administrators and town managers out there, and that synergy does not occur. So I'm very grateful of that. That makes us much better. But we can't rest on our laurels. We need to do much better. So I think part of that is how we are enhancing our budget process. And I think this meeting tonight is part of it. That's step number one, to talk about things we can do better. We are moving up the budget schedule. So there'll be early discussions with the Finance Committee and the school department, early discussions with the Finance Committee and Mike, town accountant, and myself to talk about these items. Town Council, Finance Committee, and department liaison meetings. We have liaisons to different departments on the Town Council, as is the Finance Committee. We want to get them in and get those budgets to them prior to budget and any contract presentation. So it's not like a fait accompli, well, you're telling us what was already voted on. You're coming in and having a party at the table. And he also, Finance Committee will, with the liaisons, hopefully will come to the Town Council meetings. Hate to give anybody an extra night out, but when your particular department is coming up and being discussed in front of the Town Council for their budget review, it might be nice to have the Finance Committee liaison there. And these enhancements in the process really came out of the meeting that we had early this summer with Chair Dombrowski and the Finance Committee to talk about things we can do to be better in line with the charter, but more importantly, to have a better budget process for everybody. And I think we are very grateful, and we have a great Finance Committee with a lot of talent in a lot of different areas, a lot of expertise, and we should take better advantage of that. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm ready for whatever you want.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I just want to point out to underscore how important it's going to be going forward that we have the Finance Committee integrated with the Town Council in looking at these budgets. And so we're not siloed in that the Town Council looks at budgets, then Finance Committee looks at budgets. But by the time a budget is presented for the Finance Committee, which is the first stop, second stop being Finance Committee, we want to make sure that the liaisons from the Finance Committee have been actively engaged in that budgeting process with the liaison from the town council. So when that budget does get presented before the town council can also be assured that there's at least been more engagement through the Finance Committee than there has been previously. And that partnership is very important, and that was one of the biggest takeaways, I think, from our meeting this summer with Finance Committee, the idea that so much had been previously addressed in a vacuum, and we hadn't had the kind of synergy that we were looking to have going forward. And so I think that's going to be a real significant improvement to process, and I'm looking forward to that, certainly. With that, if anyone has any comments or questions, Chair Sherman first.
Yeah, I just want to back up a second on a couple of slides. In the revenues of 2021, they're really good news. My numbers are slightly different in terms of what Steve's projecting versus what I'm projecting. But the good news is they're extremely similar. I'm a little bit more pessimistic about the state aid. 11.5 million, I think, is a little bit steep. I've got it more like 11.3, but I've got a little bit more in new growth, about 2.7 versus your 2.5. And I've got it in such a way that I'm not taking anything from the free cash, because my local receipts are higher. But they're really close. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that my numbers and Steve's are really close, and we could always point to where there's any differences. We can figure that out pretty easily. On the following slide, I have a little bit higher expectation of operating budgets of about 69 million, a little less on the fixed cost. But one of the caveats on the fixed cost, and I'll be talking about a little bit later, is on the pension. The pension number is probably too low. It will be for 2021 because this evaluation is done every other year. But I expect a pretty good spike in the pension costs come 2022. So we're a little bit different there. The other thing I was going to mention is the overlay account. And I'm not sure how many years it's been, but I think the $600,000 has not moved in at least 10 years, probably longer than that. And kudos to the department's assessors that the overlay account I don't think has ever gone over budget, at least not in my time. And we haven't increased it. So I just want to shout out to Victor and his group about how well they've been able to manage that overlay account. And then on the state and county, I've got it more like 1.7 million versus 2. But my total is at 100.16 versus Steve's 100.29. So we are obviously in very close agreement in terms of where things are headed, for 2021 at this point in time.
Thank you. Anyone else have any comments or questions? All right, seeing none, then the next item on the agenda is item number 7, that is state aid. We're breaking it into 2 parts. We're talking about first Chapter 70 funding and second other sources of state aid. And Chapter 70 funding will obviously be speaking about school funding. And when you look at our budget, and I worked with our town administrator on this just at a very high level, our budget's about $100 million. And if you back out about $14 million for the enterprise accounts, we're at about $86 million. When you factor in the school budget of $42 million plus about $8 million more in terms of benefits, we're looking at about $50 million that is conservatively attributable to the schools. And that's about 60% of the total amount of our town's budget. So to just kind of put things in perspective. So when we're talking about the schools, when we're talking about things like negotiations and the like, they have consequences, because by the time these budgets come, when we have contractually negotiated arrangements in place, that work has been done. And so it's really important as a part of this broader process that we all appreciate the magnitude of the role that the school department plays into the broader scheme of this budget, because again, conservatively 60% or 60 cents of every dollar is going towards school-related costs. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Superintendent Lyons and also Chair Callanan to go through Chapter 70, just giving us a synopsis of new school funding and have an understanding of opportunities for state monies going forward.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Dombrowski. So I'm going to talk this evening about two sources of state aid. The first is Chapter 70 funding. And Chapter 70 is a school finance program that is aligned with the Massachusetts State Constitution as well as the Education Reform Act. And it's pretty straightforward in that, the premise is that every child is entitled to an equitable and adequately funded public education regardless of a community's wealth. So what Chapter 70 does is they establish a minimum cost and a minimum threshold what towns must invest to educate students and children in their town and their public schools. So what's established is the input or what the minimum spending requirements will be for the municipality, and then what the additional costs from state aid or Chapter 70 will come in, and that's based on a formula. And so for us here in Wakefield, our local contribution is about 82% or $31.9 million. And the proposed state aid makes up about 17 or close to 18% or $6.72 million. And as was mentioned earlier, this past year, it was an increase of about $300,000, and that came in right at the end of our budget cycle, which was tremendously helpful. And so when we're looking ahead to FY21 and FY22, we're anticipating a 7.8% increase, and in FY22, with new monies that are supposed to be coming in through the Student Opportunity Act, that would be an increase of up to 17%. And one thing that's important to note here is that these increases are projections, and as Will shared in his opening remarks about the Student Opportunity Act, I think everyone in the state and everyone in public schools has been waiting many years for the Chapter 70 formula to be kind of tinkered with to keep pace with inflation and the rising costs of special education that include social emotional learning, counseling costs for students. Within this act, they're also proposing that transportation could be billed to the second funding source that I'm going to talk about in a moment. But just to tell you where we are with this act or this bill. This bill was sponsored by the Ways and Means Committee under the leadership of Senator Lewis and Rep. Peisch. And so it's currently in the Senate, passed the Senate on October 3rd, and it's heading to the House. And so, but as I said, this bill is a reinvestment of $1.5 billion, and that's $1.5 billion statewide. Anticipated increases to us will be over a 5 or 6 year window, and I shared what the anticipated increases would be in FY21 and FY22. But really what this does is it refines the Chapter 70 formula to keep pace with inflation, to keep pace with rising costs that are associated with educating English language learners, and also with the rising costs of health insurance, and the costs that are also associated with students of different socioeconomic means. And so those are things that are really critical for us to do the work that we need to do in our schools. What's exciting about the Student Opportunity Act is it also lifts the annual MSBA cap by $100 million annually for new construction and renovation of schools. And as you know, we are in the window at the high school and applying for MSBA support, which we will hear about in December. And that is desperately needed and overdue. And so we're looking forward to hear from MSBA in December on that. The other funding source that supports us is the state special education reimbursement program called Circuit Breaker. So Circuit Breaker reimburses for the year's prior expenses for students that are on IEPs that are placed out of district, and for certain services that we are providing for our students. And so it only provides for students on IEPs. It does not include administrative or overhead costs. And there are standard rates that the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education establishes each year. And in terms of income for us, we get 75% of what we apply for to the state. So this past year, we had 40 out-of-district placements. We applied for $2.3 million, and the circuit breaker funding came in at $1.79 million. Again, circuit breaker is a little like Chapter 70, and it's, in my estimate, and I think the estimate of a number of other superintendents in the area and school leaders, the funding in circuit breaker, it kind of pales in comparison to the services that are needed and the services that are needing to be increased to provide an equitable education for our students. I can talk more about that as we move on, but I'd like to turn it back over to Mr. Dombrowski to talk about other areas of aid.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Lyons. In addition to the Chapter 70 funding, we also have Chapter 90 funding and some other sources of state aid. I think one thing that's important to point out, and I think it often gets lost, although I know Town Administrator Mayo has often raised it, is the fact that Wakefield really isn't arguably getting its fair share relative to school funding. We, as a community, actually have the lowest amount per pupil of any of our surrounding communities in terms of state aid. If you compare us to Reading, for example, Reading receives $2.6 million more than we do, and we are actually receiving about $1 million less than the average comparable community. And that impacts us. That impacts us significantly. And so there is, I guess I would say, perhaps cautious optimism that the Student Opportunity Act will, in fact, help to recalibrate things a little bit. But when you look at just the raw data, we are not in line with a lot of our surrounding communities, and that's obviously a concern, I imagine, for the school committee and finance committee as well. As far as other funding sources, we receive general government or unrestricted aid of about $3.88 million. And the governor has been clear that he's looking to increase this line item at the same percentage of yearly state revenue increases. And so that would, that should mean about a 4% increase for us, potentially as high as a 6%, but depending on economic downturns, that may or may not be impacted. Another important aspect of our budgeting to point out is that Wakefield is not particularly reliant upon the upon state aid for the functioning of our budget. We receive about 10% of our revenue from state aid, and that allows us in a lot of ways to be able to weather storms better than some other communities. Say a lot of larger cities, for example, that are heavily dependent upon state aid. When that state aid shifts, even if it gets decreased by a percentage or two, that has a profound impact. That's not to say that a loss in state aid doesn't impact our community, but in some ways we've become a more resilient community because of the fact that oftentimes we've arguably not gotten our fair share from the state. And so in looking at us versus other communities, we're actually better positioned more out of necessity than out of need to be where we are. But going forward, we obviously hope that there is a recalibration there so that we're receiving more of what we believe to be our fair share of state dollars. There are also other ways in which the town is looking at state aid. One of them is Chapter 90 and specifically road funding. And if you do just kind of the back of the envelope calculations that we should be paving about 6 miles of road per year at about $350,000 per mile. That puts us at about $2.1 million that's required in order for us to meet what's really a baseline threshold. We're not there. We're not there from the state aid, and we're not there from what we're currently taking out of our own tax revenue. We had at the last town meeting, I believe, allocated $750,000, and I believe the state money came in at around, I believe, $675,000, I believe, Mr. Mayo. Yes. So, that combined, we have a shortfall there. The MMA, the Massachusetts Municipal Association, has lobbied for several years now to try to increase that funding. I think the funding statewide is about $200 million. They're looking to have it about $300 million. If they were to get to that point, then we would be able to better close the gap that we have, at least shrink it by about 1/2. But we're not there. One thing that you can expect from the town council going forward this fall is a focus on road improvements. I have been meeting with DPW about this for the last several months. They have some incredible technology that is actually going to be upgraded that will be able to do an assessment of the roads. And it makes a lot of practical sense to do it, because if we allow our roads to fall into disrepair, they become more expensive to repair. And so the more that we can, one, catch up to where we need to be, and two, have a more strategic approach going forward, it's actually going to cost us less dollars and lead to improved roads. So it's a win-win for the community. I expect we'll have a presentation on that at an upcoming town council meeting this fall. I would expect that would end up at town meeting come spring. And by that point, we'll have the most updated data from DPW as well. So that's a really important step forward. But I think it's important that we convey to the community that town council, and I believe I speak for finance committee as well, we recognize that roads are an issue and we need to do a better job. And that's what we're endeavoring to do over the next several months relative to that. The other opportunity that we see as a community in terms of being able to take advantage of state aid opportunities are projects like the Envision Wakefield Downtown Revitalization Project. This is an opportunity through Mass Works where federal funds end up flowing down through the state, and then we as a community are able to receive dollars that we otherwise would not receive. And this obviously has this sort of money coming into the community obviously has a tremendous impact in a lot of ways. It helps the economy, for one, in terms of helping businesses thrive, but it also helps to offset some of the expenses we'd have otherwise. I've spoken before about, for example, a lot of the repaving that would be done through the Envision Wakefield project that we wouldn't, as a community, have to be paying for, especially down Main Street. There's sidewalks and the like. I mean, currently I think we have about $125,000 allocated for sidewalks. That's not enough. They're in disrepair, and we hear that a lot. I know school children especially will hear that about. So those are the sorts of things in the ways in which we're looking at how we can approach state aid differently, understanding that the formulaic approach doesn't really get us to where we need to be, but understanding also that there may be other opportunities. So if we're looking at, say, $14, $15, $16 million, coming into the community in order to, in that state money through the Envision Wakefield project, those are the sorts of projects and the ways in which we can ensure that we have state dollars that are flowing through to the community and helping us, as the taxpayers on that. So with that, this item number 7, does anyone have any questions relative to what's been discussed now? Yes, Committee Member Bayer, yes.
I just wanted to question about the math that you were going through with school committee being, or the school budget being 60% of the budget. The budget was about $42 million last year. You said something about $8 million of benefits that's not included in that. Is there another, and the overall budget's $100 million, is there another 10 in there, or am I not getting the numbers right?
Right, two things on that. First off, the 60% is conservative, I should say that, and I know, Mr. Sherman, you'd probably say it's almost close to 70.
Right. It depends on what you use as the denominator. Sure. So if you include the enterprise accounts, then it becomes closer to 60 or so. But if you say, what do we vote at town meeting? And that's the last year's budget was about 82 million. We voted for 2020. Then it gets closer to 65 to 70%. So it all depends on what you're using for denominator. And when I look at the school budget, I also bring in the benefits costs, healthcare and so forth, when I do the calculations. I don't have to include pension because the teachers, for example, are at their own program, but the non-teachers are a small piece of the pension program. So there's quite a bit of math going on, but it's easy to say it's between 60 and 70%. Then you don't have to get into lots of arguments about exactly what did you include or what you exclude.
Sure.
I should say, and the math I was offering was the 100 million less the 14 enterprise, which would be the enterprise, that gets us 86 million. And the 50 million of the 86 gets you to about 60. Again, that's a conservative number. And, again, depending on what your add-ins are, figure about 2/3 of the budget, I think, has been, I think, the general rule of thumb for Finance Committee. So
Thank you.
thereabouts. Comments or questions?
Just a comment.
Councilor Butt. Sorry, we're showing microphones a little bit here. So.
Thank you. I just had two things. I wanted to comment on the Student Opportunity Act that was mentioned by the Wakefield Teacher Union representative, and Superintendent Lyon mentioned it as well. It was passed in the Senate. It is going out to the House. It is being debated in the House on Tuesday. So I encourage everyone. It is, as we've seen, money coming to our town to call both Representative Donald Wong and Representative Paul Broder and tell them how important this is. I would also call Governor Baker's office and tell him that this is important to Wakefield. As such, as we're discussing numbers, and these are all numbers we've heard before, I'm going to echo what I say every year when the school committee and the school comes before us. This is an investment in our student. Everyone believes in our schools, supports our teachers. We are proud of our school system and the students that that graduate from our school and are part of it, and it is funding regardless of the percentage that we're all proud to vote on and have. And so I just want to reiterate that, because I think that sometimes gets lost in the conversation, but it is a budget vote that I'm happy to take every year.
Thank you, Councilor Butt. Anyone else?
Me.
Chair Callan.
I just wanted to emphasize the fact that a lot of the funding that we get, for instance, through the circuit breaker, doesn't come till a year later. We have to spend the money, and the next year they'll give it back. So it's always money spent that you may not know is coming. We'll have unexpected cases move into town or pop up that we just didn't know they weren't there last year, and we don't get the reimbursement until the following year. So that's has to come out of this year's budget, and maybe you get some back next year. And the state, has been pretty good the past few years with the 75%, but I can remember many years that they did not live up to that, and it's hard for us to absolutely count on that money coming in because the history doesn't support that. So I'd be very careful, over expending that. So,
Thank you for that. Anyone else?
One additional piece of information, you'd mentioned that there was roughly 10% of our budget's been covered by state aid, and other communities is maybe 40-50%. As little as 15 years ago, state aid was 20% of our budget. And when they cut, that's when things really hurt, because it was 20%. We have moved in a position where a 10% cut by state aid is not as painful as it was 15 years ago. So we were over 20% back then.
I think that's an important point.
I just have one
Yes,
comment.
of course.
I have this whole thing written out, but I do think that it is important to have a plan, obviously, that focuses on decreasing special education costs. And there are many different reasons. You bring in some in-district services to provide services for children who are affected with special education services. But I'm kind of like what you said about the roads, and how you really need to make the investment by fixing them so that you don't have a problem in the long run. That's kind of exactly how I feel about special education services. Coming up with a plan, making the investment so that the problem doesn't get bigger and you end up with, a big type of situation that you had in fiscal year 17 and 18, where you had some unanticipated out-of-district placements that I believe before I came on school committee, we needed to dip into the stabilization fund. So it's just kind of investing, planning, and so you don't have a bigger problem in the end for special ed.
Thank you, Vice Chair Purcell. Anyone else? All right, seeing none. Item number 8 is new growth. I'll turn first to Town Administrator Mayo and then Chair Sherman as well.
I'm going to turn it over to Dan first.
All right.
You're gonna give it. See, Steve and I have been doing this for like 11 years now, so we're pretty comfortable throwing the ball back and forth at each other, at not high speed. So revenue expectations. So one of the things that we're looking at is, where are we going to get our new revenue? And Steve, if you could do the next slide. Let's see. I have not, new development. We don't have a specific slide on
Right.
new growth. Okay, so I thought we did. So on new growth, we got 1.2 million for fiscal year 19 that we're using for 20. I'm assuming that for 2021, we're going to have more buildings, more things are going to happen. I recall the days when it was $500,000 as my new growth. Now I'm at roughly 1.3, 1.4. But we also have the new Eversource and the power line that's coming in, which is going to be about $1.5 million. And that's, we think about 2/3 to 3/4 of that $1.5 million will probably start in 2021. So that's going to help us with it, and you'll see this when we get to the forecast page. Give us a shot in the arm for 2021. And it's similar to the shots in the arm we had, when we moved to GIC, that gave us a boost in healthcare costs. We had the head of the lake, we had a boost there. The power transfer station that happened on Montrose a number of years ago. When I talk to other communities, I do work with a lot of other communities, and they say, how's Wakefield doing it? How are you guys managing it and so forth? And I said, well, we had some good things happen. A bit of happenstance. Who knew that the cloud was going to move at the head of the lake, and that we're going to have that power substation as a $92 million power substation up on Montrose. But we've had a lot of new growth that's come in. So I'm assuming, roughly 2.7 million for 2021 between the Eversource and our regular increases that, because of all the building that's going on around Wakefield.
Thank you for that. Does anyone have any questions or comments for Mr. Sherman? All right. Seeing none, we'll move then on to item number 9. This is the new development impacts. A little bit of background on this. There has been a lot of discussion over the last few years about the rate of development in town and how that has been impacting or may impact quality of life going forward for those living within the community. And the town council invited the ZBA to present and give us some updates at a recent town council meeting. And it was very enlightening to hear the approach that they take, the guidance that they're welcome to receive from us in terms of where our priorities lie as a community, and what it is that we're looking to see have happen in terms of the development. We often hear this term smart development. What does that mean? We have some overlay districts now. We have some steps that we've taken as a community, but I think there's still a lot of confusion and concern. And part of that has to do with what impact does all this development have on our schools? What impact does it have on the strain on our public safety, our police and fire? What impact does it have on the services that we're able to provide and the like? And so I spoke with Town Administrator Mayo about some of these issues and asked him to pull some raw data, if you could, and just to present to us tonight. So we have just a sense of what the impacts are on the development in town. And development in town doesn't necessarily mean a population increase, and I think that's something that's important to recognize. But we do have some stats that we can look at to understand what impacts current development has had, and that should hopefully help to inform us going forward so that we're making smart decisions within our community about the rate of development and what the composition of that development going forward. So I'll turn to you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, please.
We can come back. So what I did is I did a snapshot based on some of the new developments in town and how they affected us with more taxation, more tax dollars. And you looked at 175 North Ave, which is 60 condominiums. That's where Tono's is. It's right there on North Ave. Wonderful project. That was a old commercial site that had contamination. It was bringing in $14,000 a year in taxes. Now fully built out, It's bringing in, that development's bringing in $358,000 in taxes, difference of $343,000. But with that comes some extra costs, right? More fire calls to that area. There weren't too many fire calls to an old factory that nothing was going on. More police calls, and more students in the schools. So we have to account for that. 14 Audubon Road, which is the Everly project, 186 apartments, used to be the old Bertucci's test kitchen, if people can remember that before. 92,000 in pre-tax development, 469 post, 377. A lot of fire and a lot of police calls. Part of that may be the closeness to 128. We have a lot of actually motor vehicle break-ins there, so there's a lot of calls there, so it's a strain to a certain extent, but more taxes and more students in the schools. Interesting that we're seeing, and some of our other communities around us are seeing, that apartments versus condo ownership are bringing in more students that we're seeing. 100 Nahan Street, which was the old Franklin School, which brought nothing in taxes before, now 20 condominiums brings in about 108,000. Very minimal fire and police calls. No students in that building at all. 3 Bennett Street, which has really just been completed, which are 32 condominiums. It's the old Boyd home across the street from the Galvin here, where we are tonight. Pre-tax development, 16,000. Post-tax, 150. I think that number will go up a little bit. I don't think that's caught all the sales. And I think we will see some more students there, because that's just, people are closing now on them, so not everybody's in there yet. 101 Hopkins Street, that's been there for a while, basically had 0 taxes before they were built. These are 14 condominiums right up there where Tarrant Lane was going to be. That's bringing in $73,000 a year, a number of students and police calls, what have you. 105 to 109 Hopkins Street, 114 apartments. That was built on vacant land a few years ago, bringing in about $500,000 in taxes. Increased police and fire calls, not too many to the vacant lot before, and more students in the schools. 600 North Ave, which are those 24 apartments that we just built. I think before there was a single-family home that was taken down, bringing in $55,000 versus $5,500 years ago. Not a lot of fire calls, not a lot of police calls. Those are also apartments and 4 students in the schools. So, snapshot, not really all that scientific, other than these are actual numbers. So 450 units that were built in the last few years that we're talking about here, and are bringing in 53 students to the schools, a lot of more police calls, and a lot of more fire calls. So how do we quantify that going forward? Go ahead.
Thanks, Steve. Can we really assume that all 53 students are brand new to the school district?
That is a question. I cannot assume that, and I don't know what programs they're in. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what students might have moved into the houses they moved, maybe their families moved before.
Right.
From
So
Wakefield.
from
So
Wakefield.
I'm just looking at these particular spots.
Okay.
So you're right, I don't know that.
Okay.
And I don't know what programs, and I don't know if there's a special ed mix or what have you that's
No,
possible.
yeah.
So those things we don't know.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Want me to continue? I'll continue. So I really tried to quantify it in a very basic way. The number of police calls to these units are 2% of the police calls the police have a year. So if I take that budget and I multiply it by 2%, I come up with 120,000. Very rough, but it's something to look at. Fire calls, 1% of their total fire calls are to there. I take 1% of their budget, $56,000. Increase in number of students from these properties, 53 in total. I'm saying about $14,000 a student, $742,000. Hopefully, Doug can talk about maybe some capacity and other issues there. So at the end of the day, I think what happens is we do see an increase in property taxes. We do see an increase in excise taxes, and that's hard to quantify too, because a lot of people have lease cars, so the excise tax bill they pay in their lease, and I can't always match that. I know it's a Wakefield gets it, but I always can't match where it is in Wakefield. But that's a guesstimate there. So there's a net benefit of these new developments of $1 million in my mind in that snapshot, which I think is great for the community. But when you go back, there are a lot of other impacts. There's more cars on the road. Okay, we hear that all the time. More traffic. One thing that I'm noticing, and we're noticing in our office, is because these buildings do not have yards in a traditional sense, they don't have maybe large gathering spaces always. There's a higher demand for our green space use, particularly the lake. A lot of people that want to use the lake, and you see a lot of people using the corner powwow in our common area, which is great. But I think we need to think as a community and as a town council and as the other councils here, committees here, is that are we going to have to set aside more time on the common for our citizens so they can go down there, when there aren't always walks twice, 2 weekends every year. Something we need to both days of the weekends all summer. Something we got to think about. These walks are great and wonderful, but we need to rethink that as our community needs to use that more. We're seeing a much higher demand for the Civic Center. Great facility. I'm so thrilled we have it. We see a lot more people having parties and items there. That's going to be more wear and tear. We're going to have to put more money into that, which we should anyway. So these are things that we have to think about as other potential budget impacts. I do think that there are also impacts on the schools. If we have 100 students move into the west side, let's take it, and our elementary children, we talked about class size a little bit tonight, it was mentioned. Are we going to have to have more classrooms? Are we going to have to open up a new school? Things like that. Are we going to have to start to make more staffing for police and fire? Am I going to have the fire department say to me, Steve, we need to have presence on the west side of town because of all these buildings? Something we need to think about it. Certainly more work in the roads. Are more people going to come in that are going to need services from our senior center or our veterans area or from the Board of Health and Social Services? So these are all things that we're going to have to think about and consider going forward. But at the end of the day, I, for one, am happy we have the new growth. So these problems aren't that bad to have. So I didn't know if anybody else wanted to chime in.
Thank you for that, Mr. Mayo. Councilor Chimes.
Sorry, thank you, and thank you, Mr. Mayo, for going through this. Just a couple of questions on the new projects. First, looking at Audubon Road and the police and fire calls, you talked about sort of the impact of proximity to 128 and traffic there. So presumably some of those calls could have been calls that we were getting before that development opened up. Do we have any way of trying to separate that out to really understand the actual impact of that particular development?
In that particular spot, I think it's more access, easy access from 128. Mm-hmm. In some of these other areas, so if it's a motor vehicle accident, for instance, sometimes it's an accident that occurred in front of that spot. So that is assigned to that address, but it really isn't at that address. In that particular area, I think it's the proximity to ease of getting towards it for other issues. Mm-hmm. That's what we're seeing in that particular area.
So again, as we talk about ease of getting towards it, is that something, do we think we would have been seeing some of that activity beforehand, just given
I think in that case you may not, because you wouldn't have had the units there and the temptation to come there and maybe break into a car that was parked.
All right, thank you. Second question, just, as we're looking at a couple of big projects coming online in the next couple of years between Tarrant Ave, Foundry Street, when you look at some of the data you've collected here, what's your perspective on sort of analogs between some of these upcoming projects and what we've seen over the last couple of years? I mean, I don't want to put you in the prediction game for this, but as we have a sense of sort of a Tarrant Lane coming online, do we think that looks like some multiple of 105 to 109 Hopkins Street? How do we take some of this information and, sort of project out, at least at a high level, what we think the impact is going to be on some of the big initiatives going forward?
Yeah, I think on Tarrant Lane, because of the mix of units there, we are going to see more children in the school system. And I think it's going to be, when you look at this, is it 10, we can say it's 9% of the units have children in it. I think that'll be a little bit higher at Tarrant Lane, because I think you're going to see more 2- and 3-bedroom units in that mix there, because it's a 40B project. So I think that's something we need to be ready for, and I think it's great. We want people to move to our community and be citizens here, but I think we have to be ready for that going down the road. So my prediction is on that, I think you'll see more. I think on the Foundry Street properties, I think that's going to be more, to begin with, transit, people that want to be right on the train and get on there. I think about having a 24-year-old son, that would be a great spot for him, to hop on the train if he had to go to work. I don't anticipate any children coming soon. You don't know anything, do you?
I'm working on it.
You work, okay. And, but I think that would be, that's all anecdotal. This seems to carry this out a little bit, prove it out, but it's something that we're going to have to look at and see.
Vice Chair Santos.
Very quickly, Steve, I agree with you that I'd like to have us take a look at the policy with regard to the amount of walks we allow. I've been hearing from folks who live in town and traffic is impacted when they're just trying to do an errand, but more importantly, I think our enjoyment of the lake. If we have 2 walks per weekend, certainly in the warmer months, I mean, the lake is our gem. We want to share it a little bit. I don't know that we want to share it as expansively as we have. There are certain walks that have a strong history that I think we keep. I can't imagine, doing away with the buddy walk. But some of the smaller ones, I don't know. I don't know that the benefits that we get from sharing the lake for that kind of controlled amount of people coming in, shutting down streets is worth it.
I think that's a discussion we need to have.
Yeah. Councilor Donato.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My concerns as an effect, and it's a potential effect in my mind, and it goes back to my time being on the planning board. As we promote and we produce more housing in the commercial districts, it's always been my fear that you're going to have a greater loss of the capability of shifting the tax rate. We currently at 2872, but as we encroach further into the commercial zones and only get residential out of those properties, the numbers are going to change over time. It's always been a concern of mine. So if we become more determined to put more housing into our locations, I fear that our tax rate over the course of time, extended time, is going to change and ultimately have to go up because there's not going to be enough commercial property to absorb the loss. So if you go to 1585, there's a big concern over time. Something for us to think about long range. It may not be now, but what we put down for groundwork now, when we're talking economic development, it could be a potential budget impactor down the road. It may not be while I'm on the board anymore, but it could be for future generations out there. The money has to come from somewhere. And if you're only relying on residential, I think that's going to cause your taxes to go up over time because you're bringing more people in and the expenditure may not be there. I may be all wrong, but it's something that I always feared about from the planning board aspect going forward now. So I thank you for your time. I just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you.
Yes, committee member.
Thank you. Since we have the new project snapshot up, and since we're all here, I'm wondering what we should all be thinking about. I'm on the school subcommittee for the FinCom, and to build on Ann's point and Jonathan's point, there also seems to be a consideration of concentration of where the projects go. To stick to my financial knitting, how do you guys all think, both from a school committee perspective and a town council perspective, does a certain amount of development trigger a redistricting for any particular elementary school or things like that? Is there an incremental cost that we should be thinking about? So it's not, to me, to Ann's point, just like a net total number, but where it might be concentrated. Tarrant Lane's probably going to be big, may impact, for instance, Walton. Something else could come down the line in another district. So I'd be curious what our collective thinking is or should be on concentration, not just net development.
Does anyone want to offer a thought on that to be recognized? Superintendent Lyons.
Yes. Gerard, thank you for your question. I think it's critically important. And I think, one of the things that we've done just to kind of accommodate both new development and also kind of the new construction that we've had at Walton is we have had to create buffer zones around districts that had solid lines to spot redistrict students to make sure we could accommodate them. One of the things that's really important is that we have, it looks like, the right number of classrooms, and we're very close to capacity, but not all the students live in the geographic areas that will allow us to create perfect class sizes of 22 to 25. So there has been spot redistricting that we've needed to do to balance class size and balance the use of facilities. Instead of, and that decision is made, if we didn't do that, what we would have to do is create a bubble classroom in one of our smaller schools, for example. And that creates difficulty not only in the physical space of a building. You have to remember, a school like Greenwood has 10 classrooms. So to put a third kindergarten in there or take the one free technology room that they have creates the dilemma of where now do you teach technology, but it creates a bubble class, not for 1 year, but for 5 years. And so, and I want to thank Mr. Mayo for adding this kind of linear projection around 53 students and what the total financial impact could be. But this is, I don't know that it's quite this linear, and that because number of students in the aggregate don't always equal need. And so, I think that's something that we're really going to need to look at. And I think we're going to work with our school committee very closely. And Chris Callanan and I have spoken about the possibility of doing an enrollment study and really looking at what the projections could be to really be thoughtful about trying to plan ahead. And we'll kind of mention some of that on our later slides in terms of challenges. But thank you.
Any other comments from anyone else? All right. Seeing none, thank you. I should also mention, Mr. Donaco, I know you had raised about the commercial versus residential rates. One other thing we should always keep in mind too is the economic vibrancy of our downtown and our town in general has a pretty significant impact. This town about 6 or 7 years ago voted to approve the local options on meals tax. That currently is generating about $356,000 a year. DOR projected back 6 or 7 years ago it would be about $130,000 a year. So we definitely have, to your point, Vice Chair Santos as well, the idea that there are people coming to the community. How are they utilizing the community, and how can we make sure that we preserve that the economic interests without compromising the quality of life for the residents? So I think that's an open discussion that we'll need to continue to have going forward. Thank you all for your feedback on that. Moving on now, the next item is item number 10. This is the bond schedule and future projects for the town. I'll turn it over to Chairman Sherman, who can speak through. I think we have a slide as well to kind of walk us through the bond schedule, and we can talk a bit about the projects on the horizon.
So what's up on the screen now is the inflows and outflows are expected right now for projects that we have approved. And I mentioned them earlier, like the Dolbear, the Woodville Public Safety Building, the Recreation Bond, the Senior Center. There's a whole host of things that are in our debt schedule. And so what we show as outflow are the payments to the bondholders. Wall Street gets their slice of the pie, and you'll notice that the outflow takes a pretty significant drop as some of those bonds get paid off. For example, you can see in 2022 it drops down about 1.2 million from 2.8 to 1.6. Then another one comes off and we're down to 1 million, and that stays the same for several years until I believe the public safety building comes off in 2027. And of course, the impact is the net change. Instead of having a net outflow from the fund in 2020 and 2021, it switches around, becomes an inflow. So that 287, which becomes 900,000 and stays about 900,000, I think if the schedule went further, it gets over 1 million. Now is monies that we can devote to other capital projects and other capital needs. So, we got some good news there. We have some free up some cash we don't have to send to New York. And what it does then on the following slide is that it takes our current balance, which is roughly $250,000 to $300,000, and of course it inflates it up to as much as almost $8 million in 2029 if we built nothing. If we don't do anything at all with our buildings, we don't have any projects, it just takes off. The reality, of course, is that we are going to have to spend some money on various projects. I don't include the high school in here because our feeling is that this is something that's going to be like the Galvin, will be a debt exclusion when and if we get around to it. I should say when. It's not if. It's when we're able to secure the funding from the state and make that project go forward. But there's other projects. There's other things that are going to come up that we're going to have to spend money on. For example, you talked about the roads. We had talked about a road bond. It's something that the town of Watertown did a couple of years ago, where they just issued a bond for many millions of dollars and then started fixing everything about the roads. That could be something we use that debt schedule for. Other things, for example, the public safety building. We have DPW garage has got some issues. There's talk about spending some money on Lake Quantapowhat and cleaning that up. Roads and sidewalks, clearly we need to do more, and I mentioned Watertown and their approach. But the high school is something that I think is going to be an exclusion. I don't think that's going to run through the bond schedule, but time will tell, and we'll see what happens with that.
Could I just ask one question?
Yes.
When you talk about the bond, possible bonding for roads, wasn't the discussion that it didn't make a lot of sense to bond for work that there wasn't capacity there to get done?
Right, yeah. So one of the things that led us not to do what Watertown did is exactly that. In other words, a couple issues. One is capacity and the ability to actually do the roads, and the other thing is what we don't want to do is have a brand new road come in and then a gas light somebody else decides to cut.
Right.
And now you've got a hole again, and you've got a problem within a year or two, and you got more potholes. So those are the two things I think that really led us to just hold off on the bond approach, but it's not off the table completely. We just set it aside. We tabled it for the time being just because it didn't make a lot of sense. But at some point in time, it may make sense to do that.
I will add, too, that having spoken with DPW multiple times on this issue, they do a really interesting analysis, and they basically are able to categorize a certain road or a section of a road into one of three categories. And if you, in essence, nip it in the bud, it's far less expensive than if you let it get to the middle zone or the great need. So it goes from like a 1 to a 3, but it doesn't just go up a little bit in cost. I mean, it's exponentially. I think in one instance, if I recall correctly, it was something like an almost preventative measure was 10 times less expensive, in the long run than allowing it to fall into great disrepair and then ultimately having to do it. So they will provide some very, I think, compelling analysis relative to that, because it is something that had been talked about for some time. Definitely.
And Steve, there's another slide, I think, that not that one, the yellow, that one. Yeah, I want to just mention this one is that the yellow section is the Galvin School. And you'll see as our costs drop off, and what we really need to do is to keep that roughly between, looks like about almost $7.5 million spend. We need to keep that constant. We need to focus on the buildings we've got. I'll look at the Hurd School. The Hurd School, for example, the roof leaks. And it's been leaking for years, and we just haven't addressed it because it hasn't been a bad leak, and it hasn't really hurt too much. But there's a ton of buildings in this community that need some work, and they need some help. And I'd like to just to see, instead of having that drop off, which is what we have today, let's think about what we want to add to this graph such that the $7.5 or $8 million continues or goes up a little bit. And that's really what we need to think about in terms of what our needs are to maintain our buildings and grounds and fields, roads, sidewalks, and whole works.
I should add too, with respect to the one project, the public safety building reassessment committee has been meeting for a very long time. Several of its members are here this evening. And we're at a point now where there will be a lot of community outreach, a lot of public forums in the coming months, with the expectation that come spring, that may be in a place for the town to make a determination relative to the future of that project. But that is something that is off on the horizon, just to put on everyone's radars. With that in mind, does anyone have any questions or comments relative to item number 10, bond schedule and future projects? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to item number 11. This item is environmental sustainability. As Mr. Mayo mentioned previously, environmental sustainability is increasingly becoming an issue for our community and all communities across the Commonwealth. And it's not just about any sort of climate change or climate effect, but it's also about a lot of the practices and procedures that we follow, recycling and the like. So at a very high level, Mr. Mayo, if you could perhaps just inform the community of some of the things that you see going forward and the financial implications.
No, absolutely, and I'm very happy that we have an environmental sustainability committee to work on these things. Thank you, Councilor Smith-Galvin. He's going to be very busy over the next few years. Remember a story about 15 years ago, before I was in this position, and a woman was telling me about how great it was to live in Wakefield, which I agreed with her 100%, of course, and that the thing that she loved is that she put out her trash once a week, it was taken away, there was no issues, never had to think about it, it was always gone. Well, let's put it this way, we need to think about it. We need to think about what's in it, where's it going, how we're gonna pay for it. So things have changed. I think trash removal and recycling, they're like utilities now. And I think we have to approach it in this effect. We have a couple of these contracts coming up, and we know good disposal is much better for the planet and for our future generations. But we're currently paying on our trash removal $68.35 per ton, and that is for that to be, and that's the disposal fee. That's what the disposal yards are charging for that. That contract is coming up in a year, and my fellow town managers that are out there, and theirs are coming up now, the new prices out there are hovering around $95 or $100 a ton. That's a huge issue for our citizens, for our community, for the schools, in getting rid of our trash. But we should never let no good crisis go without answering it and maybe making things better. So I think we are going to have to look at things like composting and taking things out of our waste stream and reusing them and recycling them. Now that turns us to the recycling portion. I remember years ago, we used to actually get paid per ton of recycled products being removed, okay? Right now, it's built into our contract price. We don't get paid anything, but they pick it up, and that's what happens. That contract is coming up too, and there is not the demand for the recycled product for a lot of reasons as there was before. So that may be at a price to take away of $70 to $100 a ton as well. Just to quantify those numbers, we probably average about 2 to 2.5 tons per year in recycling. And in trash, which has come down a lot, we probably have about 7,200 tons. So it's quite a nut there. Remember, we spend about $1.7 million in trash recycling removal. One of those articles, we talked about it. So we're going to have to do a lot of work over the next few years. We're going to have to change how we think. We're going to have to change how we handle bulky items, whether there should be a charge for that. Right now, there isn't. There is a charge for white goods, not for bulky items. So what we really need to do is how do we reduce what goes into this stream by reusing, by being smarter, and what have you. So that's a challenge that we're going to have, and I look forward to working with that on a high level with everybody in this room. Another item is solar power, and we are moving towards that. We're looking at that at the Greenwood School. We have a grant of $50,000 to do some work on that, because what that will do is that will reduce the load on the grid. It will help us to be not so susceptible for brownouts and what have you. And it's also the right thing to do for the planet. Let's have spend less on fossil fuels and what have you. The other item is, and we're looking at this, and this will affect us, as we look to purchase our fleet, is looking to buy electric vehicles. And we're not there, we could get them for everybody, so you're not going to have maybe an electric police car yet for a patrol car, but there are other items that we have to look at to take those electrically. That is going to make a change in how we look at our capital expenditures, how we look at putting charging stations or what have you into town. So those are things that we need to be thinking about and talked about, and it'll be on our radar over the next few meetings. I look forward to working with the community on this, and particularly with the town council. But that is something we need to take into our forecasting to make us a little bit leaner in that area and more environmentally friendly. So very high level. I don't have any numbers for this yet, but that's something we'll be working on.
Thank you for that, Mr. Mayo. And if we could just flip back one slide, if you could just, the forecasting,
Yes.
if you could just briefly speak to that as well, because I think it ties into what you're talking about.
Well, sure. So this is part of, Dan working together, he's been great about taking our forecast, and I think we go out even more years than that. Doesn't fit on the slide. So when we think of what we're bringing in, look at that 2021 at a high level, we're both at about $102 million, $102 million coming in for expenditures, 102 coming in for income, and then a surplus. We have to think about if there are some changes, if there's changes in our refuse and recycling costs, if there's changing in our capital costs, because we are going to go to be more environmentally friendly as we should. These surpluses might not be as big, and that's okay, but I think we'll be better off maybe on the other end. Maybe our tonnage will go down and we won't cost more on trash over there. So these are things we're going to look at over the years, and that will have an effect on all of these, the expenditures and the income, and how we fare financially as a town. So these are some very important numbers. We look at it and we tweak it. Dan and I, Kevin and I, members of the town council, members of the finance committee talk about we go forward, and we're actually quite lucky to have this, and I think we take it out to, boy, oh boy, farther than this, maybe another 10 years, Dan, I think we go. Yeah, so it's
One of the things that I would point out on the last column on that slide is you'll notice that the percentage increase from year to year goes down, and that's because of Prop 2.5. And although we've had some great increases in revenue in terms of new growth, in my forecast, I'm not saying that's going to be sustained. There's going to be a point where things, I believe, is going to slow down. And as it slows down, you're starting with 2.5 plus new growth. Well, if new growth starts slowing down, now you're getting closer and closer to 2.5%. So one of the things on a long-term basis I'm looking at is we really do need to keep our total spend down to the 3.5 to 4% range, unless the state decides to get really charitable and provide much more funding than they have in the past, or perhaps they add another. We got the hotel and meals tax, which has been a great boost. If there's something else that comes down the line to augment our income, but as I look at the forecast in today's environment, I just don't see us running up 4 or 5% increases. That 542 for 2021 is the new power line, and that's a one shot, and then it's continuing after that. But in terms of as a percentage increase, we get one shot, and then we're back to normal.
So with that, any questions on item number 11, environmental sustainability? Committee member Flynn.
Mr. Mayo, sorry. With regards to the solar, are you working in conjunction with the gas and lights department?
Yes.
Councilor Smith-Galvin.
Thank you for that. I think as we think about the environmental sustainability and increased costs from a lot of these things, I think in the short term, what we need to do is also put a little money aside, perhaps in the next budget, for some baseline. So when we're looking at carbon footprint, we don't have a greenhouse gas baseline assessment. We're a community that has our own electric and gas utility, pretty unique in the state. So I think it's pretty easy to get that information, but we should be thinking about setting the baseline so that when we're looking 10, 15 years down the line, we can really see that. The other thing on trash and recycling as well is, as we become a community that has many more apartments and condos, I'd like to really be thinking about, they pay the taxes that everybody else does, but they don't get pickup from that, and that might just be something that we have to be thinking about in the future as well.
Questions or comments? Committee Member Bertrand?
I just wanted to point out that the Permanent Building Committee is working with the architect and the school department, and the possibility of the solar at the Greenwood School may not occur due to structural and fiscal issues. So, just like a little cautionary note there.
Committee Member Fortier.
So this is for Dan Sherman. Can you remind me, or actually Mr. Mayo, so we don't tax at 2.5, correct? Like where are we when we set the taxes for the town?
So the way it works, and Steve, jump in, is we take our total base, and this is, for argument's sake, let's assume it's $100 million. It's not, but for round numbers, it's easy. You take the 100 million and increase it 2.5%, just the total. And so that gets you 102.5. And let's assume we have $1.5 million in new growth. So now we can spend 104. So now we know what our spend is. So now how do we peel that back to say, okay, how does it relate to residents, commercial? I mean, I think Paul's spot on. It's something I've seen is my own taxes are not going up 2.5%. It's going up a lot more than that because commercial has been going down and residential has been going up. So we know we have 104 in my example to spend, but we have to divide it between commercial and residential. Then you just work it all the way down based on your assessed value and so forth. Victor gets involved, and that's where the 2.5 comes from. People think that their own taxes are limited to 2.5. It's not. It's our total spend is limited to 2.5 plus new growth.
Gotcha.
The town council has voted the past couple of years to not max out the amount that we could charge.
Correct.
So
Correct.
I think
But
that was your point, right?
And that's a yearly discussion with the council.
I guess that's my point, is that every town meeting I've gone to, that's been something that's praised, right? That we don't tax at 2.5, and that's X number of dollars in the taxpayer's pocket that is saved essentially. So I guess I just wanted to see what the gap is between what we actually tax and what the potential is. Not that I necessarily want to go up to the ceiling, but I'd like to see what that gap is.
I can.
Mr. Mayo?
Yeah, I think in some years it might be 200,000. In some years it might be 600,000. Might be 400,000. Depends on where we are.
Okay. Thanks.
Councilor Smith-Galvin.
Mr. Bertrand's assessment of the Greenwood. I just wanted to be clear that we do have a $50,000 grant from the state, and it doesn't have to go on the Greenwood. So the community won't lose that funding. We'll find a more appropriate place. I just wanted the community to realize that.
Yeah, that might be good. Because the solar panels might go through the roof.
No, yeah. We don't want to put anybody
Probably
in
won't
danger.
help too much.
Councilor Chines.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just an observation on the forecast. I know, having been on the Finance Committee, where this gets refreshed a lot during the budget process, I've always found the multi-year forecast really helpful, and maybe ask a request that, as we go through the process this year, being on the town council now, that we do share that across the boards as we go through the process, so we understand how the individual budgets that we're assessing impact this total picture. I think this is important now, just as I think about where we are from an economic standpoint. I mean, we've had a run of a number of good years in Wakefield and with the national economy. I am concerned that if the global economy slows down in the next couple of years, we'll have to make some more difficult choices. And so I just think having this multi-year forecast, looking out 10 years, is going to be really important for all of us as we think about some of the decisions we have to make over the next couple of years.
Thank you for that. Any other questions or comments? All right, seeing none. The next item on the agenda is item number 12, and it's titled Measuring Progress and Success. And in creating this agenda, I spoke with my counterparts and Mr. Mayo and Mr. Lyons as well. And this is intended to be an opportunity for us to, as a group, determine what we're doing well, what we can do better, ways that we can measure success, ways that we can determine what programs are working or how, or the mechanisms that we can use to gauge or measure results or success. If we think of tax dollars being an investment, and the question for all of us is, are we making the best investment of the tax dollars? Are there some areas that require more investment? Are there others that perhaps pulling back some investment might be more appropriate? And also with this as well, part of the ongoing discussion with Mr. Lyons has also been the idea of how do we measure success within the schools. Some people will look at school success and they'll see Wakefield ranked differently than a lot of other surrounding communities. And in many various surveys that are explained in various ways, and I understand that, Wakefield isn't ranked as high, although our per pupil spending is pretty comparable, and the caliber of our teaching staff is exemplary. So part of this agenda item is to at least offer up some suggestions, or perhaps to be thinking forward of what have we done well, what best practices can we apply in terms of measuring those things that can be measured, and how do you measure success with anything that we're doing, either programmatically or from any of our tax investments. Mr. Mayo, I think if you could begin, and then we'll turn it over to Superintendent Lyons, who's able to speak in more detail on that.
Sure. I think, and you look at some of the past accomplishments, we have restored a number of services. Fire prevention officer, we've certainly expanded police and fire, police presence with really looking at the social component of the police department. I think that having a environmental manager in DPW has been a great move, particularly where we're looking at really our vulnerable populations in some of the effects of climate change and what have you. I think we have done a pretty good job giving veteran services and what have you. I think we've been able to do a lot of this because we've done a lot of collaborating with other communities, and that's something that the town meeting and the Board of Selectmen, now Town Council, had to take a stand on. Wasn't easy to say we're going to share services with other communities, but that's made a difference. So I think that's been a good accomplishment. We have done okay in some of our capital projects. We have a lot more to go. I think that the town should take great pride in our bond rating. Having a AAA bond rating is no small feat. It's not just window dressing. It saves us a lot of money in our borrowings. The problem with the AAA bond rating is that it only has one way to go, and that's down. So I do worry about that, because like on your own credit score, you notice when you go and you get that new car or you get your new mortgage, all of a sudden your credit went down for no reason other than that you have more credit, more things. So that's an issue. I think we've done a good job with our reserves. I think that we have hit that area of not having too much reserves and certainly not having too little reserves. And I think that our unfunded liabilities, which while I'll put as a progress and a success for the town, I think also will show that as a challenge, because we still have a long way to go there. But and I think Dan will talk about that a little bit, if you don't mind, Dan.
Mr. Mayo, you mentioned the AAA bond rating and how that's saving for us. Can you give folks a sense of what, on an annual basis, just kind of ballpark what we're saving by that exemplary rating?
When I asked our bond counsel to run that for me for one of the bonds, and what they told me is that it would go up X percent, and I forget what that percent was, but it probably was about $300,000 a year, right, in that ballpark for that particular bond. Mm-hmm. So that's a big difference. Think about your own mortgage. You get a mortgage, and if you get a rate of 3% versus a rate of 2.5%, you're saving a lot more with that 2.5% rate. So that's been that is a real helps us do more projects. Okay, we put that into our bond schedule. We can do more projects. We can maybe do them quicker. We can maybe add a little bit more to that project to make it a little bit better. So that's a real savings. That's every year. Mm-hmm. So that's $300 over the course of 10 years. It's some nice money.
It's consequential, no question. Yes. Indeed. Mr. Sherman.
Yeah. So one of that last unfunded liabilities, I think, sort of points to the AAA bond rating. As we started funding our other post-employment benefits, retiree medical for retirees and actives, also known as OPEB, And a number of years ago, we started putting money aside. We're putting in, what 1.8 million the last few years, and we expect to put in 1.8 down the road for a while. But we have $18 million in that account, which sounds great, but it's still, it's only, the total liability is 83 million. So we're still like 18-20% funded, which doesn't sound great, but we are way ahead of our peers. And it's one of the things that the rating agencies look at. They say, what are you doing about, your unfunded liability for retiree medical? And we're ahead of the game, and it's one of the things that they cited, our reserves and the fact that we're tackling this unfunded liability as a reason for giving us that AAA bond rating. So it really has paid off for us to jump on that 5, 6, 7 years ago. It's paying off.
Any questions or comments on, or actually, I'm sorry, before that, Superintendent Lyons, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Dombrowski. I appreciate your comments in the intro into this conversation, and I can always appreciate the reference to an accountability rating. And I think that that's important. And I can share with the group here and with anyone who might be viewing that, we take data very seriously, and we look at a number of different aspects quantitatively about how our schools are doing, how students are included in regular education who may have learning differences, how our student population is changing, and what we're doing to meet the needs of our students. And so I'll talk more about that when I talk about some of the challenges that we face. But, we take the progress and of our students and the growth of our schools in positive ways and the responsibility for that very seriously. And so that's I guess my first piece that I think I want everyone to know. And when we think about success, one of the things that we're talking a lot about is how we're using data and what data is kind of instructive, or what is information that we can respond to. I know Mr. Dombrowski and I have had and spoken about some of our ratings, and U.S. News and World Report or Boston Magazine, and one we're a little ahead some of our peers, and the other we're a little behind some of our peers. And I think a difference that we have is, from my perspective, those kind of magazines are designed, and those ratings are designed to sell magazines, where the leadership are taking kind of a longer view and working with the school committee. We're thinking 10 years, right? We're thinking about a plan that can work for us across the board, not only with budgets, but with facilities and with our students. And we're thinking kind of taking a 10-year view and trying to make the shifts where in time we're going to see the changes that we would like to see. But every year we set goals, and every year we expect to make those goals in regard to student growth. On the end of October, we're going to be doing a review for school committee on the new data that's come out in regard to our MCAS testing and our accountability ratings. The information that we have received from the state is that we've made progress toward all of the goals that they have set for us in the accountability system that they have created. So those things are positive. Some schools have progressed a little bit more quickly, some schools are lagging behind, but that data is really a light for us to really think about what changes that we need to make to better support students to get better results. So that's a very quick. We're also creating a data or district data dashboard to track kind of the grade level achievement and the growth of our students internally, and we're not waiting for MCAS to come around to just use that as a once a year check. So that's another piece that we'll be rolling out this year. We're going to be working with a data consultant that's going to help us, and I can tell you that at the school level, I don't think our principals have ever used more data in the last 2 years than they're using right now to think about, what shifts that we need to make for students to create better outcomes. So we're fiercely committed to that, and I think, I had a conversation with Ms. Vea over the summer. She's a big fan of data and asks, I think, all the right questions when all these metrics come out. You know, what are we doing? What should we be doing? What could we do differently? And, you know, in our data review that we talked about in August, we're talking about kind of our investment in our schools. What are we spending? What are our returns? And, you know, after a deep dive, you know, I was kind of pleased when she said to me, well, it doesn't sound like you would change a thing. You just need to work the plan. And those are her words, and I appreciate the feedback. And I think that she's exactly right. I think we need to work the plan, but we do need to tell our story more effectively. I do think we need to talk more about our budget and how that relates to the costs of educating children. You know, and you know, Mr. Dombrowski alluded to this, this ROI idea. So our return on investment. How do we know we're getting a good return for our money? You know, if I could make an analogy, that's a little like asking, you know, a family with children, how do you know you're getting a good return on the investment that you're making in your children at home? You know, sports cost X, food cost Y. Are they acting in a way that you appreciate, that we can measure and publicize? The answer is not always, right? Not always. It's a work in progress. And sometimes school progress is like that, I'm sorry to say. Sometimes it's messy. But I can tell you that we have a plan. I think the school committee is fiercely committed to accommodating students and making it work, making our schools work for our kids. So that's just some quick parts. I would be happy to come to any one of your committees individually to talk more about data, about our MCAS data, about our accountability data, and anything that can help provide greater insight or understanding about the work that we're doing. So,
thank you, Superintendent Lyons. Just before questions, Mr. Sherman, I think there was one other slide in terms of some of the challenges.
Yeah. Steve, how much of this one do you want to tackle?
Are we not talking about schools anymore?
We're going to. We're just
next.
catching up with one slide. Then we're coming back to the comments. Yes.
Why don't you start, Dan? I'll come after you.
All right. So, in terms of challenges, we got the public safety building. We've talked quite a bit about that, and more will be coming this spring. Our infrastructure, our fields, we've actually in pretty good shape. So I'm not sure why that was on there, but we do have a few fields that need some help. We do have some business development to create. Education, and Superintendent Lyons is going to talk more about that in a moment. I talked a little bit about buildings, and we've got some real issues with several buildings. And then unfunded liabilities is also listed here as another challenge. I had mentioned that the post-employment medical benefits were at $18 million in assets. We have $83 million as liabilities. So we have an unfunded liability of just that piece, $65 million. On the pension plan, we have $187 million liability with about $130 million in assets. So we have a $57 million unfunded liability with the pension plan. And then on the capital side, DPW and the capital committee have identified about $60 million worth of capital projects that need to be funded, well, probably over the next 5 to 10 years. So if you add that all together, we're close to $180 million of unfunded liabilities that we have coming at us over the next 10 to 15, 20 years that we need to deal with. So, I always have that in the back of my mind and say, oh, things are good, we can spend on this and spend on that. And then I said, well, wait a minute, we got $180 million hanging over our head that we have to pay for over the next 10, 20 years. And that's, almost twice what we're spending now on an annual basis in total. So some cautionary notes on the unfunded liabilities.
Good. Thank you. All right. So with that, we'll open it up to comments and questions on measuring progress and success. Committee member Fortier.
You want to get into the schools challenges?
Actually, sure. Why don't we finish that up then?
Okay.
Sorry. Hold that thought for one moment, Mr. Sherman.
Yeah. So I think Doug, you got some. This is your slides to talk about your challenges.
Yes, sir. So the challenges that we're facing at the school level, you know, one of the first most important things that we need to be attentive to is the retaining, recruiting, and developing outstanding teachers and administrators. You know, truth be told, it's harder now than it ever has been to retain and recruit really talented teachers and administrators. I think we've been fortunate. Another part of that challenge is to not only retain and recruit and develop, but also retain, recruit, and develop a more diverse teacher corps that matches our more diverse student group. You know, it's something that we don't talk about often, but it is a goal of ours, and it's something that we're working on, and it's an area of growth for us. In addition to that, we are looking at developing a facilities master plan collaboratively with DPW. Our director of facilities, Bob Shiroli, will work closely with Joe Conway and of course PBC, who are always terrific allies for us. But we really need to take a hard look at the high school. There are parts of the high school that are not ADA accessible, which is a significant issue for us. And let me be clear what that could mean. If we have a student that may be rising from the middle school to the high school that can't access parts of the building because his or her wheelchair might not fit into an elevator carriage that was installed in the 60s, it's just too small, then that's a problem for us, right? And so these things are things that need to be addressed very quickly, you know, and so those are things that we'll be discussing in terms of our master plan. But you do know, and I think I've talked about it earlier, in December, we will hear back from MSBA to hear if we've been accepted into the grant for a new high school or for a newly renovated high school. And so we'll be reporting back more information there. I included Greenwood in this conversation, not ahead of the high school and certainly not ahead of any other projects that are happening in town. I know that the town safety building is a critical part. I know that, you know, that we've been working at that for some time. And I'm not for a second thinking that, you know, one school project has to go ahead of something that is a priority on the town side, but to not mention that we need to be thinking about Greenwood. We need to be thinking about what it means to heat and cool Greenwood. There's no air conditioning in Greenwood, right? It's a spectacular building. You know, it has stood the test of time. But, you know, for students to have to all walk to the basement to use the bathroom in 2020 is a question. ADA accessibility at that school is a question. You know, what, you know, a renovation for that school could look like. You know, I think we could do some really great things at that school for less than we invested in Walton. But that's a longer conversation, and I know PBC will be kind of partnering with us on that. You know, the other thing that we need to pay attention to is the rising costs of our special education needs for our students. You know, one of the things that we always get asked when a student goes out of district and the cost is really high or exorbitant, we always get asked the question, did you think about developing a program in district so that we can keep the student here? It's, you know, something that might be more economically feasible, but it also keeps our students in our community, which is a tremendous benefit as well. And the answer to that question, I can't say it enough, is always. Always, always, always. You know, a side note, we came in under budget in special education last year, and the reason was that we invested a lot of our special education money in programming to accommodate students and keep them in district, which I'm very pleased about. There's also a rising cost of our English language learners, right? Our students that have English as a second language. And so when I started here 5 years ago, we had one ESL school in elementary. All of the students went to Woodville. There were 24 students. Now we're up to about 70, and we have students in all of our elementaries, middle and high. It's something that you don't often hear enough about, but it's critically, critically important. And I'm pleased that the students aren't required just to go to one school, because language development is a social process, and to send them to their neighborhood schools makes a tremendous difference for us. We're also thinking about the economics of graduating students that have greater experiences in all of our schools. And that includes STEM activities and STEM courses, right? We, like you all, look at kind of the economic forecasting, both globally as well as domestically. We think about where could our kids work? What skills do they need? We think about developing comprehensive engineering and coding programs, and how could we do that? What is the cost? How can we do it over time? It's something that we're thinking about constantly. But additional challenges for us is just really creating opportunities for our students and our faculty to create internships so that our teachers can get out of school and maybe go learn at an industry where we might be sending a child to then come back and teach their subject. Those experiences, both for our teachers and for our students, are critical, right? We hear all the time that students need greater soft skills. They need to be able to work on teams. They need to be able to collaborate. They need to be able to read a room and act accordingly, right? We hear this all the time, and that message has been delivered. And probably, a thing that I think that gets kind of swept by the wayside because we are here in Wakefield is, the achievement gap, as well as the opportunity gap that students have to participate like their peers and develop. Our greatest diversity in Wakefield is socioeconomic. We don't talk about it that much, but, there is a really large gap with our students in terms of what they experience based on their household income. We need to be thoughtful about that, because when we think about ROI or we think about progress or how our students are progressing, not everyone is starting in the same point, okay? And so those are just, a few of our challenges. No pressure. I think, we love our work, and I think you've heard me say it and you'll hear me say it again, we're fiercely committed to it. And I'm really believe that we are doing great stuff. So I look forward to continuing to share with you. If you'd like me to come to any of your committees to talk more about this, I would be happy to do so. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Superintendent Lyon. Questions, comments? Committee member Fortier.
I want to respond to the notion of rankings, okay? They are incomplete, and I think an easy and kind of lazy way of determining success. It is not an appropriate way to measure our progress. Our kids are not commodities. They're not GPAs, they're not SATs, they are not quantitative data. They're children with unique needs, with characteristics that are unique to them, and they have every right to be treated as individuals and not as numbers. And that is our job as educators, to do this. The state is asking us to measure growth. And if you've been listening to Doug, you would have heard him say that many times. It is a child's growth, their journey, that is most important, not necessarily their endpoint. So if you want to ask us how we're doing, don't ask us where we rank. Ask us what we're doing to progress, what metrics we're using to measure our success. But don't ask and measure us against some other community using data that may or may not be comparable, may or may not be from the same year, and as Doug mentioned, is solely used to sell magazines and newspapers. And I would leave this with, I would imagine that you would not ask a parent to describe their child and expect that they're going to start with things like, he's an A student, he got an 1800 on his SATs. They're going to say they're funny, they're a good friend, they're creative, they work hard. And those are the characteristics that we are developing. And we have spent a lot of effort working with our teachers, with our community members within the schools to address these factors that make them good people and good community members. And those are really hard to measure. So I want you to listen to what we say when we say that we are working for the betterment of our kids, and I don't really care what their GPAs are. I really don't. I want to make sure that they have high quality of life, that they've learned, that they have friends, that they're moving on and doing things that make them happy and they feel supported. Thank you.
Thank you, Committee Member Fortier. Any other comments or questions? Mr. Bertrand.
2 points that I wanted to raise that Doug mentioned regarding the facilities. The first thing, Doug, as far as with part of the accelerated repair program of the MSBA at the Greenwood, you have to have a ADA approved handicap ramp and an ADA approved bathroom on the first floor. So that's part of the program at the Greenwood that's going to be taken care of as part of the roof project. It is required by the MSBA.
Be a great project for us this year.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, right. Watch it, Doug. The second point is, and I hate to be the devil's advocate or the gloomy Gus here, but what happens if we don't get approved for the high school? When does this community have to think about doing other smaller renovations to the high school? And what Doug mentioned is that it's not ADA approved. It's not approved. There has to be, you can do a project as long as it's 30% of the assessed value of a particular building. And the assessed value of the high school is in the 35, somewhere around $1 million range. So about a $10 million project you could do without having to do the entire building and not making it 100% ADA approved. So there has to be, if we don't get approved, this community, I think, has to start discussing when do we start, because unfortunately, that science area in the high school is the same science area I had in high school in 1966. So it needs work. Thank you.
Thank you, Committee Member Bertrand. Any other comments or questions? Councilor Donaka.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just by listening to Superintendent Lyons and some comments regarding ADA necessities, several years ago I brought up a proposal for the town to consider, and I'm going to throw it out there one more time this year to a newer body. The town may want to consider taking part in the CPA, the Community Preservation Act. The rules have changed considerably as to the uses of the monies collected. The governor even put a minimum threshold on there now where they would reimburse no less than 50%. And with that being said, if we go with the numbers that we were originally talking 12 years ago, if we come up with 300,000, they'll match at 150,000. 10% has to be used for open space, 10% has to be used for affordability, and 10% has to be used for historic. 70% can be used for any number of items that are listed on the state site, including making all town buildings ADA compliant. That's a benefit that we can't overlook, I don't think, at this time. It's something to explore to see what the initial cost would be to the public, but as far as what we could reap in benefits from it, I think it outweighs it at this point in time. It's 12 years later. We might have a chance with younger minds going into the future now at this point than we did 12 years ago. But I did a quick calculation. We'd have over $5 million in that account right now if we adopted it 12 years ago. Okay, because we were funding it for the first 5 years at 100%. So we would have a lot of money there that we could have utilized. but I would like to have some consideration. It's a way of us getting money, and as I said, you just mentioned 2 buildings that would need ADA compliance, and if we can't find the financing for a new high school, if this gets adopted, you could have at least $300,000 to do at least one school. At least get even an elevator put in one of the buildings, if it was necessary to make it ADA compliant. It's just a thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Tanaka. Other questions or comments? Councilor Chines.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to comment a little bit on the sort of tools to evaluate, particularly on the town side. I was glad to hear Superintendent Lyons, you talk about the district, sort of data report card, the district data dashboard. I think it's great that you're looking at that, as part of sort of how you guys measure your progress from a school standpoint. I'd like to see us do more of that on the town side. I think as we looked at sort of how we quantified our success in Mr. Mayo's presentation, one of the things that we didn't talk about was service effectiveness, either from sort of any objective standard or also from a resident perspective on how we are doing in the services that we're providing. It's great that we've been able to restore funding in certain areas, but are we actually providing the things that folks in town need? Are we actually providing the services that people in town expect? And so one of the things I hope that we can do as we think about measuring success on a go-forward basis on the town side is sort of to take a lesson from some of the work that the schools are doing to look at the things that are important measures of success, find ways in which we can put data and measurement around those so that on an ongoing basis we can say, we're hitting our marks in terms of providing the services that residents expect from us.
Thank you, Councilor Shines. Other comments or questions, thoughts? All right, seeing none, then we'll move on to item number 13, which is actually next steps and closing comments. So I'll turn first to Chair Callanan.
Tonight's been interesting. I guess it was good to know that there aren't a lot of new issues that I was unaware of that came up tonight. So I guess it's good that I think we're doing a fairly decent job of keeping each other informed on a regular basis. Just going forward, the school committee has, we just this week filed our year-end report for last year. It's due in October, and yet we're already starting next year's budget. We have a meeting next Friday with the FinCom liaisons coming in and discussing framing next year's budget going forward. So we're already starting next year's budget in October.
Thank you very much for that. Chairman Sherman.
Yeah. A couple of things I'd like to mention. First, I really want to thank the Town Administrator Mayo and Assistant Sherry for putting this all together. I know it's a lot of work and figuring out seating and, reminded me of the days back in the 70s when the issues of Vietnam and the size and the shape of the table. If some of you old enough remember that those peace talks lasted months before they actually sat down just because of the table. But anyway, thank you very much. Appreciate it. I also like to thank school committee for coming, the finance committee members who've been able to make it, and the town councilors. Ed and Chris, thank you very much. I also like to thank WCAT. Thank you guys. I think you did a great job. I love the little island here that everybody can see the slides. Great idea. I'm also very much looking forward to this next budget season. We've got 2 new members, one of which is, this is his first meeting, Stefan Chase on the end. Unfortunately, Don was not able to join us. He's in Mumbai on business. So I excuse him for that. It was already set. I think in closing thoughts I have is that our financial condition is strong. 11 years ago when we had the first tri-board meeting, it was extremely weak. We had a lot of problems. We had a lot of issues. We weren't spending money in capital. We did not have reserves. Our free cash was low. We were cutting staff. We were cutting services. It was not a good time. And I think we showed tonight that things have turned around. Things have gotten a lot better. And we're going forward optimistically, as I am, that things will continue to go better, and we're on the right path. Just keep our fingers crossed that we don't hit any bumps in the road. So those are my thoughts.
Okay. Thank you for that. I'd like to just take a moment to also thank WCAT. Thank you to Ryan Boyd, Ian McDermott, Patrick Goodwin, Sean DiGiambattista, Patty Benequette, Barbara Worley, and of course the captain of the ship, Tom Stapleton. Thank you all for putting this together. This is not an easy feat, and they were able to do a great job. And thank you also to our Department of Public Works for their assistance as well. Thank you, Superintendent Lyons, for your very helpful insight, as well as yours, Mr. Mayo. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Sherman. Thank you, Chairman Callanan. Thank you, Ms. Dalton, as well, serving as clerk. And there were a lot of logistics coming together, and you made it come across seamlessly. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. As I mentioned at the beginning, I see this as an historic night for us, and I hope it's the first of many in a new tradition that we establish as three different bodies coming together. We have incredibly dedicated, incredibly insightful volunteers here, and whether they're elected or appointed, they're here with the best interest of the town in mind, and we're incredibly indebted as a community to the work of everyone sitting around these tables here. So I thank you for that. I'd also like to thank our very large audience that stayed all the way through. Please, everyone, be careful getting out. It's going to be a lot of traffic, certainly. There's two people for those that can't see it.
Three.
Oh, three. We have three. Thank you. But again, I want to thank everyone for taking the time this evening. And with that, I will entertain item number 14, a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved by Chairman Sherman, seconded by Vice Chair Santos. All those in favor? Aye. Thank you very much, Wakefield, for watching, and good night.